Thank you all for being here. Michelle asked me to talk about my identity as a military spouse. And so when I was thinking about that, I actually never lived on base, so I don't have stories from that experience. And so when I was talking to Michelle, I thought, but I do have a sense of identity as a military spouse. And so that's what I wanted to talk about today, crafting identities beyond just who we were yesterday and who we are today. And so I'm a storyteller by nature. So a quick look at our agenda today. So do a quick set of introductions, and then as a storyteller, I do have us going through Acts 1, 2, and 3. And then at the end of our time together today, we'll just do a quick reflection and conclusion. So that's how I see us spending our time together today. But before I, though, start my own story, I just did want to share something that's really powerful to me. This is one of my favorite quotes. It's from Amanda Gorman. She was the inaugural poet back in 2021 for President Biden. And I love this quote. I find it inspiring. I'll share it with you. I hope it inspires you, even if not just for our time together today. When day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? The loss we carry, a sea we must wade. And I just think that that is so beautiful. So, quick set of introductions, so you know a little bit about me before we spend some time together today. I'm Jenny Blair. I not only identify as a military spouse, I also identify as a Sun Devil. I've been at ASU over 2 decades. Starting as a student worker, I always joke how they can never get rid of me. I collected some degrees along the way, moved between different student services departments. Right now, I wear a couple of different roles. I'm Associate Director of Enrollment Services for both the downtown Phoenix campus as well as the LA Center, which has been a fun new challenge for me, figuring out the Fashion Institute. I sometimes teach on the side. I teach a uni class out of ASU Success by Design, and probably my most salient identity is being a military spouse, which is what brings me here today. I'm supporting my husband through his last years of his time with the Navy, then jumping ship, which is a funny pun now that I think about it, jumping ship to the Army. Sorry, I just came up with that right now, feeling good about myself. And then including a deployment to Afghanistan. And now, really quickly, I'd like for those of you at home and in the room with me today to just do a quick introduction of yourself. You can do it to yourself. So just really quickly, I invite you to, you can keep your eyes open, close them if you want. Just take a moment to think about how you identify. Are you a mom, wife, brother, mother, son, uncle, student, athlete? You know, what do your identities look like to you? And I invite you, as you're thinking about yourself, you know, we remember that as we go through our time together today, that identity is fluid and it changes all the time, right? So hold yourself in space today as we go through our time together today and be thinking about who you are. Okay, so those were our introductions. Now let's just jump into Act 1. So when I was chatting with Michelle and she was talking about, well, just talk about your identity as a military spouse. And so I'm like, okay, well, identity, what does that mean? And so I talk about this part of my story as the shadows and the light that we cast, which is my way of talking about the ways that I present my identity are both shadows and light that I cast. And I did the exercise myself, the one I just had you all do. And so when I was thinking about who I am, I'm a daughter, and even though I highlight my hair now, at one point I was an actual blonde. You can see there's photographic evidence when I was 3 of being a real blonde. I'm a mom. Like, my boys are older now, they're in college. So I don't know that Jenny. I guess she was there at one point. I identify as a sister, an aunt. Sometimes I'm a cartoon. I also identify sometimes as an athlete, not really. Always as a Sun Devil, as part of a Sun Devil team. Sometimes my husband and I are silly and we dress up. What's interesting though, and I don't know if you all felt this when you were going through the activity, I totally don't remember her at all. I hope she had a good childhood, right? I think so. I kind of remember this person, right? But I was her, right? And then there are things like that's a recent picture just of a couple, I think, months ago. So I know that Jenny. But I think the other scary part is, I don't know tomorrow's Jenny. Like, I hope she's nice. I hope she's kind. But I talk about this because our identities, like, I'm obviously the same Jenny I've always been, but I'm somebody totally different. And so be thinking about that again as we go through our time together and what makes up you, who you are. And so the reason I'm here, probably the most salient identity for today's space, is my identity as a military spouse. That's how I got to be here. Thank you, Michelle, for inviting me. So this is a quick picture when our kiddos were young. They're big now. We were at an airport, Jack's parents, my mom. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Flat Stanley. Was that a thing in grade school for you all? He's a storybook character that's flat, and he travels the world, and totally our second grade class won because Flat Stanley traveled 90,000 or 9,700 miles or something crazy. Big banner day for the Blair family because we won that hands down. But sharing my identity, again, as a military spouse through your deployment through 2013, 14, and then back as a contractor, which we'll talk about a little bit later on about what those timelines mean. So after talking to Michelle and thinking about, well, what does it mean to be a military spouse, right? Well, there's lots of things, and we heard a beautiful keynote speaker today talk about what it means to be a military spouse. She had a beautiful metaphor about the bread rising. And so I was thinking about that. It's like, okay, yeah, I totally resonate with that. So here are some of the lessons I've picked up along the way, especially at the beginning, right? When things are kind of fun and sexy, and you're like, oh, I'm a military spouse. Like, okay, I can do this. You start learning like, oh, there's a lot of responsibility. And I think, I don't want to use imposter syndrome because I feel like we've used that a lot today, but you get acclimated to the family readiness groups and you go to yellow ribbon programs and they tell you as a military spouse, oh, your job is more important. And you're like, I don't know, I don't think so. Like, my life isn't changing, but his is. But you do start to get this sense that like, you got to get it together because he's going through stuff and you got to figure your stuff out. So that's how I started to internalize that lesson. And then I started to learn the lesson about streamlining communications and connections. And I call this one the broken pipes can wait for your weekly roundup meeting. And the lesson you learn here is that if you only get to talk to your partner once a week, once a day, you don't waste time talking about things in the house that are broken. So you put them on the list for the Friday roundup, and by then it's either fixed itself, you don't care, or if it's important enough, you talk about it and you figure it out. But you learn very quickly about how to maximize your real estate with time and communication. The other lesson I learned was like, okay, well, how am I taking care of myself, right? Because you do hear about that, right? You understand that, like, you know, the whole metaphor of like, I've got to wear the oxygen mask so that I can be strong. And you're like, yeah, that makes sense, I get that. So you're trying, though, to make sure, though, you center your own health and wellness against what your military spouse is going through. And then this next lesson is probably the most important, but also to me the most complex. So I call this lesson, how do I remap distance and orientations with the tag, where does it look like where he lives? And what I mean by that is, for me as a military spouse, there's like an opacity that sets into your life. Like, your life kind of looks the same, sort of. It's kind of like a fever dream. It's like, oh, I've been here before. I think I know what I'm doing, because your job stays the same. Your kids stay the same, and at least for us where we live stay the same. Maybe my experiences became exaggerated or elongated as a single parent, but mostly my life stayed the same. What happens is it's like, I don't know where he is. I don't know where he lives. I don't know what his room looks like. I don't know where he had for breakfast or who he had it with. And so for me as a military spouse, that unknowingness of where he was physically started to affect me emotionally, spiritually, physically. And you know, you play these games about like, oh, where in the world is Jack San Diego? And you have your kids in their second grade classes plotting, you know, dad on the map. But that kind of starts to feel weird over time. And so I think for me, again, as a military spouse, like, that was a really germane part of my identity, was just trying to figure out, like, how do I live with the unknowing of what his life is like without losing him entirely in that process, right? And it's not always up to him to tell me about that stuff, right? Because you also have things like OPSEC, and I can't know where he is. And so you really have to start to figure out how to live with that space of ambiguity and uncertainty, or you won't make it out of that. And so that was Act 1, where I talked about identities as both things that we had been, our shadows, and then the light that we have, things that we are now, things that we look towards the future. But then as you get older, right, life happens, things get a little bit heavier. So I move our family into Act 2, which is what I call the losses we carry. And I'll give just a little bit of a warning ahead of time. So I tell this next story not for sympathy, but when Michelle asks me to talk about our family's military experience, and my husband's in the room with us, we can't unpack what happened to us as a family, which I'm about to share, and what happened in his military career. So even though we don't always like to lead with trauma and catastrophe, that's not us entirely. We're not a single story family. We're all these other things as a family. But when we talk specifically about our identity as a military family, the narrative spools are just woven together, and we don't know how to unpack them. So with my husband's consent and then sharing that in grace and compassion, I share with you that on May 21st, 2014, while my husband Jack was deployed to Afghanistan, he had been there about 10 months, our 5-year-old was murdered. And Jack was brought home on a Red Cross message, not given the dignity of finishing his tour with his brothers and sisters in arms, not given the chance to demobilize, brought back on a police escort because of what happened to our family. And you can imagine life, I thought this was a great picture, life imploded, it exploded, it evaporated, it condensed, it just everything, every part of life happened at the same time. And you can imagine then those next 18 months were wild for us as a family. Something I think very particular again about how you start to identify yourself, because identity happens both internally and externally, right? So there's things that you know about yourself, and then there's things that people tell you about yourself. So something that was happening for us in this journey is that my husband had, again, not been able to have the dignity of demobilization, but was coming out of a war zone, had been there 10 months. So that therapy, that grieving space, that healing space of PTSD is entirely different than the healing journey you take as a bereaved parent. They're totally different. And so therapists are like, we don't know what to do with you all. Because in child bereavement, they tell you, go hide, go be away from the world. And then in military therapy, it's get up, get yourself back on the horse. We had VA counselors with good intentions, get out there, you gotta get back out there. And then you had other therapists like, nope, go hide away until you can kind of just let this wave crash over you. So that part of our identities where we were both grappling with this new space of who we were as a family and then being told who we were was just very complicated for us. And again, I'll give a context warning for this space. I'm going to share some things. I've had given permission by my spouse to share these things. I don't share them to build empathy or to garner your sympathy. My point in sharing some of these things is that when I think about my identity as a military spouse, particularly post this catastrophic event, all I could think about was how to get smaller. That the only way that the complexity of our life was going to be survivable is if I became invisible. And so again, I share these next things with you just to give you a sense about why I felt like I needed to shrink, because I felt like life was too big to be able to hold all of that and me. And so during this time, we were adjusting to shifts in financial status. My husband, right, had not been able to finish the deployment, was trying to figure out what that looked like for his reserve career. Really didn't feel like it was okay to go back to work in his civilian job, right, given the level of trauma he was dealing with. So at the time, I was the adult working, trying to just keep our family together. We had 3 other very little children that we were trying to raise who didn't even understand what had happened to their sibling. Because it was not a natural death, we also had tons of complex legal and court spaces that we were trying to maneuver, and just mechanically showing up for that was just overwhelming for my husband. I was trying to figure out how to be a caregiver, and again, I mentioned earlier, these 2 different paths of grieving journeys that you're trying to take. And so I'm trying to figure out how to do this. And I think I went through some VA certification classes, like to try to just figure out how to help him, because we still had the war stuff that we were dealing with on top of all of this. And so I was trying to learn as much as I could to help him. Softening the impact of depression on those we love. So it wasn't just a son that was lost, it was a brother and a nephew and a grandson. And so everybody else was experiencing enormous amounts of pain that we were also trying to hold space for. And then if we're being honest again, you know, we all figure out ways to self-soothe, right? And trying to protect my husband from choices that were maybe harmful to him or harmful to our family, and also giving him the dignity of his space to do the things he needed to do to heal, but make sure they didn't hurt him or our family in the process. You know, doing drill weekend doesn't really seem like it matters much when you're in this kind of world, right? So I remember even working with some military leadership, you know, trying to apply for leaves of absences, because you've got a 16-year military career that seems like it just went up in smoke, right? And even though that wasn't necessarily the most important thing in our lives, it was, because that was his identity. And I knew that at the time, I was trying to help him preserve that identity, right? Because future Jack is gonna want that, right? If we're talking about identities and the shadows that we have. Just taking care of the household. And then I see Michelle, I'm glad you're here. I'm gonna say this because you say it. You say it and you name it. So Jack had suicidal ideation, and we fought that every day. And the days that I couldn't help him, and I was in over my head, I made sure I reached out to people in PTVC or people in our church community or his buddies. I remember calling, you know, JB. I don't even know JB's last name, but it was somebody he deployed with. Bro, JB, can you help me? Because I'm tapped out. And it's asking for help. Sorry, go back. And so that's a lot, right? So we lived in that space for a long time, many years we were in that space. And so this is something I called, you know, my turning point, right? And when I was talking to Michelle and thinking about identity, so you can see why I was trying to shrink, right? Because all of that stuff is too much. You can't do all of that without being small, or at least that's what I thought. And you know, we were trying everything. We were camping and hiking and boating and biking and taking pottery classes, and we were doing this therapy and that therapy, equine therapy, aquaponics therapy. Like we were just trying to find peace wherever we could find it, right? At one point we stumbled into gardening, just fell backwards into gardening. I take a picture of this though. This is the one thing that grew in our backyard. This is in our son's memorial garden. And it actually came to be, that's why you see, if you know Jenny Blair, that's why the sunflower is so important to me, because this is the one thing that grew in the midst of all of this pain. It was, you know, it's heat resistant, and it can grow in lots of different soils, and it turns its face to the sun. And I'm like, oh my God, that's so beautiful. And like, sometimes you just need something creative to hold on to, because everything else has been destructive. And so I found that to be a really beautiful turning point, because you start to realize, like, okay, I don't have to shrink, because that's not what the family needs. They need me to be as big as I can, and that's how we're gonna get through this. And then I put this picture, Jack knows what I'm talking about. So about 2 years into this craziness, things were not getting better. And as a couple, we made the decision, which I know probably people around us thought we were crazy, to send him back to Afghanistan as a contractor. And I think in part the reason we did that was because, you know, things weren't getting better here. And there was this part of me that's like, I can't get any smaller. And if things are going to implode, maybe they need to implode overseas. And that's kind of what we decided as a family, right? That when you have this catastrophic loss that happens, it sends you out of orbit. Like it just knocks your marble right out of what it was doing. And so I think at that time we could only think, well, what's the craziest thing that we can do to maybe knock our marble back into orbit? Let's send you back to where you came from. And that's what we did. And he was gone for 2 years. That was a really long time. And so it's not all of them, but for every day, you can't see all of them here. every day he was gone, I put a sticky note on our bathroom wall. And I think somewhere in the 2 years, I'm like, I can't even get ready for work anymore. How's the girl supposed to put her lipstick on if she can't even see herself? You got to come back home. But it was a chance we took, right? Because you're taking a chance on, future Jenny, future Jack. You don't know who they're going to be, and you're betting on yourselves that this is going to be the right choice. And thankfully it was. It was the right choice for us. Which then brings us then to the redemption part of our story, our hero's journey, which is what does Act 3 look like when you come out of that space of loss and darkness? What can that look like, right? So we've got color back in our butterflies again. And so ultimately, in talking to Michelle, because at first I was a little hesitant. It's like, I don't really have a sexy story, and I don't really know what you want me to teach, right? What do you want me to say? And when I was thinking about, well, I actually think I've learned a lot, and maybe that can be helpful to folks, is that ultimately, if you find yourself shrinking, reminding yourself that that's just one of your identities. It's just one part of your chapter in your whole narrative, right? And maybe for me, maybe that was longer than I would have liked, but it was what it was, right? That's what my story was. But then figuring out that, like, no, there is a sense of hope, because sometimes the sense of hope comes just from surviving it. Just, if you can just hang on long enough until something changes, sometimes that's the turning point you need in order to expand into the space you were always meant to have. And so that's this idea of, when you think about you in the future, your future self, like, what is she doing? What kind of space is she holding for herself? What roles is she serving in that capacity? And then doing your best to support her, because you're going to be her in the future, right? So do your best to take care of her as you go forward. And so just very quickly, because as a storyteller, you also want to leave you with some actionable items, right? Oh, maybe you could try this at home, right? You don't need a doctor's permission. So here are some of my personal strategies for that turning point where I talked about, where it's like, okay, nope, I've gotten as small as I can, and now we get to go out again. Actually, for those of you that were in the session before, Dr. Mitchell talked about the difference between hope and optimism, the fact that hope is active. It's not a temperament you're born into. It's, Jenny's not always this sweet and kind. Ask my husband. He's like, I don't know what Jenny you all see. That's not the one I see. But I practice hope as an active thing, meaning, like, what are my goals? You have to set a goal. You have to support yourself. You have to find accountability partners, right? But it has to be an active thing, because a state of mind is not enough to survive some of these places. Another concept I picked up along many of our therapy spaces, something called learned optimism. It's also sometimes referred to as the 3 Ps. And it's the idea that something bad happens to us. Usually it's not personal, right? Like, somebody didn't do this to you on purpose, or the universe isn't picking on you. Just life happens to us, right? Also, not necessarily in our case with death, but often things aren't permanent. If you lose your job, you get another job, right? That state of unemployment isn't always permanent. And the idea of pervasiveness, okay, this bad thing happened and it's affecting this part of my life, but it doesn't affect all parts of my life. And so being able to compartmentalize this helps you to see what parts of your life are working and focus on, wellness spaces in your own life. We've talked a lot about this today, the idea of women empowering women, patterns of support, and PTVC totally saved us. I say that to this day, right? Like, people were there for us. People can say what they want about the VA. They showed up for us. You got to figure out how to use the resources correctly, but if you use them right, they show up for you. Asking for help, like, sometimes it becomes hard, and sometimes when you have a big T trauma loss, friends are kind and helpful until they're not, right? I think sometimes people put a timeline on grieving, like, wow, you guys have been a mess for a long time. It's like, yeah, you probably should leave. We're going to probably be like this for a while. But then you start to find, though, the circle of people that let you bounce checks, right? The people that let you dine and dash are the ones that you want to keep around. And then just figuring out how to sit alone, right? Like, they talk a lot about that in behavioral therapy, where it's just like, just feel it. I mean, it's scary. You can't stay there forever. And I used to try to find a safe place when I got upset. but to just kind of let yourself feel those things. And then just honestly, just starting to have new habits and routines, sometimes even small things. If I started exercising again in the morning or started hiking again or whatever the thing is for you, sometimes even small tweaks can have a really impactful transformation in your day-to-day life. Or pursuing educational and personal aspirations. And again, this is the part too when you've been shrinking for so long and you're like, no, I'm gonna go get a second side hustle as a faculty associate, which is what I did. I started teaching. And the other things I did, because I always felt guilty, right? Because in that space of shrinking, I just thought, well, I have to conserve as much energy as possible because our life takes up so much fuel. But really what I came to find out that if I'm being thoughtful and intentional with the way I design my life, that I can actually do things to invest in myself that end up supporting my family in all these really cool ways. And I did. I ended up teaching a uni class and I learned all these cool things about growth mindset that we use on our kiddos to this day. So I really appreciate that. And then honestly, Michelle, thank you for giving me this chance, because I always say that 10 years ago when the world came to help us, doctors, lawyers, judges, social workers, the whole army of people that showed up for us, you stopped taking an inventory after a while because you're like, I'm going to pay you all back, right? I'm going to figure out how to get you all back. You can't. So the one thing that my husband and I have decided to devote our lives to is just being good people, because the best thing we can do to thank those that helped us, that showed up for us, that didn't give up on us, is to pay it forward, right? Because you all kept us alive, and all of you know who you are, and the best thing we can do to repay you is to be good people that it ripples on, right, in other spaces. And as we come to a close, we're getting to the end. You've all been so patient. I want to point out one very specific piece of advice that's near and dear to me. So not this director, sorry Sean, another director that I love very much, of the Pat Tillman Center, would check in on me every once in a while, because my husband used to work at PTVC, so we've always had a relationship both professionally and personally. So at the time, the executive director of PTVC reached out to me and, how's it going, Jenny? Not well, right? That was usually my answer for a long time, like, it's not good. And I remember he said to me, I'll edit it, Michelle, because today we're supporting women. But he said, in a man's life, in a woman's life, there's all these threads. You have all these strings, like you're a marionette, and you have your professional string, your personal string, your friends, your hobbies, your kids, whatever the things that tether you to this life. And you can be okay so long as you don't cut them all at the same time. And I just remember thinking, well, I can do that. I can keep one string attached. And if I can have my husband keep one string attached, well, then the other stuff, eventually you hope grows back. And so I've always kept that piece of advice, and that's why I have it as its own slide, because even just like visually for me, that idea, like when people say I'm hanging on by a thread, like this is that space, right? I'm hanging on by a thread right here. And so I appreciate that over time, it takes a while for these things to grow back, but they grow back, the strings grow back. And so I have a really quick activity for those that can do this in person, and then also if you're online. So if you're online, if you want to take out maybe your iPhone and open up a quick notes app, or if you're on a Google Doc, I'm just going to pass out really quickly blank paper and an envelope. And I just want you to write a letter to yourself, just following the prompts, right? Think about who you want to be, who you're going to be, what promises you're going to make yourself. But really do it, right? Really think about future you, right? Because no one's going to take care of her the way that you are. All right, Jack, you're not a girl, so we're not going to have you do this. So just take a moment. I'll do it too. So when you think about your future narrative, think about, how can I expand into the Michelle of tomorrow, or the Sonia of tomorrow, or the Mo of tomorrow? What is she going to look like? What things do I want for her? What things do I hope for her? And just maybe spend 2 minutes. Those of you online can do it as well. You can dream big, right? She'll be giving her TED Talk. That's what I think when I write my letter. I'm giving a TED Talk somewhere. Or maybe you finished Pat's run and you're super proud of her. Or today, listening to Dr. Freeman, now I want to go back and get my PhD. Michelle, you might have to be my accountability buddy. I just said it out loud.
Okay. I got you.
And as you're writing, just be extra kind to her. Because for all you know, she's had a really crappy day. Some guy at work was a jerk. I also have to give credit to Michelle when we talked about an activity and you said, think about something simple but impactful. So I want to say thank you for inspiring me. You talked about the carrying the weight activity. And then as you come to a close, we're actually a little bit early on time, but that'll be okay. We'll get a little bit of time back today. But as you start to wrap up, I invite you to, actually seal it and put it somewhere safe. You might open it in a day, a week, a month. I feel like in these kind of activities, you always know the right time. You always know when it's right to open it again. It's kind of interesting how this is symmetrical against the presentation I just attended, which was from Dr. Lisa Mitchell, where she talked about writing a letter of gratitude to someone else. And I think there's a lot of beautiful symmetry in that's also a great exercise. It releases dopamine when we express gratitude to others. But I think this is also a cool then sort of parallel companion piece to that, which is writing a letter to yourself. I guess you could also write a gratitude letter to yourself. Thank you all for sharing. I can see you all writing, and thank you for holding space for this activity for yourselves. Yeah, please.
So from a psychological perspective, what do you think changed in Jack when he went back to Afghanistan? Like, do you think that helped?
So I'll share from a spouse perspective, getting to, and I think I can share with your permission, retracing the physical journey back, because remember I talked about how he had been given a Red Cross message. At the time, we were also not allowed to tell him what had happened because they were nervous and scared given that it had been a homicide, and they were unsure of Jack's state of mind being plucked from a war zone. So we weren't even allowed to tell him what had happened, just that our child had been injured. And so Jack will talk about, going back through the tarmac in Kuwait and Germany and Turkey and, all the places he had to go to come to us. And then when he went back to Afghanistan, he literally retraced backwards. And I think you've shared, Jack, just physically having to deal with the triggers of those memories, but then you were in control of that moment going backward. It's at least how we used to talk about it. You want to share a little?
Yeah, the VA does something where they use VR to try to accomplish this, and apparently we were ahead of our time because we just went and did it in person. And so it was really it was not a plan. Like, I think I think it just worked out that way. And so then, you know, I came back, I left Afghanistan, flew from Afghanistan to Kuwait. They took guns, they took all the stuff, and then they put me on a plane and sent me back. And then to go back, because I was going back as a contractor, I flew the same path. Like, it was a little bit of an outside of the normal because when you deploy with everybody else. So, but I walked through the same steps, and getting back in I think it just kind of helped jumpstart my engine.
And to center back to women too, at least that concept of kin keeping is this term, right, where you feel like you have to be, I think a lot of women feel this term, you're taking care of everybody, you're remembering everything, this doctor appointment, that family event, you know, all those things. And I think if we're being honest too, from a caregiver, from a female nurturing point of view, I couldn't keep taking care of him on top of everything else, if we're just being honest. And so sending him back to a place that made sense to him, right? I mean, war is crazy, but it made sense to him. But sending him back so that I could just deal with our family, I think honestly just literally opened up space for me, because I couldn't be a caregiver to everybody. And I needed somebody to catch him, and I didn't think it could be me anymore. Ladies, thank you so much. I keep that to yourself, right? I invite you, I saw Michelle put hers in the envelope, to consider putting it in the envelope and then putting it somewhere safe and special so that you'll know when the right time is to open it. So thank you so much for engaging in that activity. And then again, we're just kind of coming to the end of our time. But again, just as a storyteller, it's one thing to have a personal story, but then really where the power is where it becomes universal. And so I just wanted to end on a few concepts, right, about a call to visibility, which is for the women in this room, for the women listening, your identities matter, right? It matters who you are. Even just the act of me getting to present today, going through this process of thinking about what I wanted to say, reminded me that I'm important and unique, and maybe nobody else could have done what I did. And same for all of you, right? You're probably doing things in your life that nobody else can do, which I think is so amazing. So the call is to each of you to remember how worthy we are, and that we deserve to own as much space as we can, right? That nobody is served when we become smaller, right? The world only benefits when we are as big as we can be. And then this one actually, as I was talking to a girlfriend about today, you know, we were talking about the idea of like, what does identity mean to you? And, you know, and this idea that you kind of have relationships with all of these different identities. And I thought that was kind of a cool concept, right? Because I also think about how I have different female friendships, and some women I talk to all the time, some I haven't seen in 10 years, but I still consider her a friend. And just kind of owning, like, maybe that could work for even how I think of myself. Like, I'm not always an athlete, but I might try Pat's Run, right? Or I'm not always this, but I'm gonna try this. And so I thought that was a cool concept. And then the entire point of Rise today, which I knew, but then getting to see it live and in action, which is so beautiful, is just the ways that we're called to lift each other up, right? That there really is power in our collective strength. And when we're given opportunities to share our voice, right, we get to be amplified. And I think there's power in that, right? Like, you know, we didn't have men speaking at the keynote today. And I think that was such a beautiful nod to, we didn't need them. We didn't need them, we just needed us to make this beautiful event. And I think that that is so powerful. And just, again, this concept of storytelling, right? You all probably, I want to hear your stories, right? You probably all have beautiful stories in your experiences with the military. And if I don't get to hear them today, make sure you tell somebody, or maybe I get to hear them, future Jenny gets to hear them. And so ending where we started, which was from our poet Amanda Gorman, that everyone shall sit under their own vine and fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. If we're to live up to our own time, then victory won't lie in the blade, but in all the bridges we've made. And so I invite you, for the letter that you just wrote today, use that as a bridge between who you've been, who you are today, and who you will be tomorrow. Thank you so much for letting me share today. Thank you.